Today we're going to be making a leather pouch, not for anything specific. So I've just got this cork sanding block which I've cut to size, and I'm going to use this to form the pouch. So you can see I've already gone ahead and marked out the size of the leather where I'll need to cut. And it'll be a two-part pouch. So this larger piece will form the base, the back, and the flap, as well as some of the sides, and the smaller piece will be sides and the front. So first things first, let's cut out what we've marked. Okay, so there we've got our two pieces. What we're going to do next is line them up. You can see I'm just using vegetable tan leather here. Thickness is roughly 3.5 millimeters, 4 millimeters, give or take. So it is quite thick for a small pouch, but when you're just buying scrap leather, you don't get to be too picky. So now I'm just going to grab something round. I'm just using my spool of thread here. I'm just going to round all the corners. Start by marking it out. I'm just going to start at the bottom here. We may end up doing something different on the top for the flap. We'll see how we go. Okay, so you can get some curved punches. If you've got those, great. Go ahead and use them. I'm using a knife. As long as your blade's sharp, this is pretty easy. Shouldn't have any problem getting a decent curve there, and again, using a nice sharp blade, you can always refine it. Edges will all be cleaned up after stitching anyway, so as long as it's good enough to line your two pieces up, so you've cut on a line, and any little imperfections can be tidied up later. Alright, so you can see they line up well. Now we're going to I'm just using these binder clips or bulldog clips or whatever you want to call them. A little bit of leather in between, just to protect our pouch from being marked by the jaws. And we're just going to use these to keep the leather lined up while we punch it. Two should be enough for this project. Alright, now because we've got some pretty long stretches here, I'm using a 6-hole punch, and all we're going to do is come in. You can measure this if you like, but I'm pretty confident in keeping it straight. I think I'm coming in around 5mm from the edge there. Starting off here with the top blade, or a punch if you like, roughly the same distance, so about 5mm from the top of the pouch. Keeping it lined up. Give it a tap to get it located and make sure it's not going to slip, and then drive it home. So you can see that the punch has made it all the way through there. You want to make sure it does get through properly, otherwise you'll have a hard time later when you're stitching. You'll struggle to get the needles through. So we work that out. This is where those clips come in handy. Just keeping everything lined up. And all you do is you put the first punch in the last hole. Make sure that you keep it nice and straight. Same again. Tap it to get it located, make sure it doesn't slip. And then finish it off. Just do this all the way around. When we get to the corners here, we've got those nice radiuses that we cut earlier. So we're going to go to a smaller punch. Let's see, I've got a 4 here. I might need a 2-hole punch, just so that we can be consistent with that curve. Keep the holes evenly spaced from the side of from the edge of the radius there. So this one, we're just making 1 hole at a time, using one of the tines to locate us, keeping the spacing between the holes the same. 1 hole at a time until we get around that curve. Almost there. Probably 1 more and we'll be there. So, line it up, drive it home. Okay, and now we can go back to our 6-hole and continue along the bottom of the pouch here. Now, these punches are new for me. I've had another set, but these ones are new. And I'm going to try at some stage to actually wax the tines. And hopefully that'll make it a little bit easier to remove from the leather. And once we get up to a clip there, I'm just going to move it. Make sure you keep one in at all times, so that you're always keeping those 2 bits of leather lined up. Okay, and on we go. Alright, so you can see now we've finished punching. You can start to get an idea of how this pouch is going to work now. So obviously at the moment the top here is square. I think that we'll probably put a bit of a shape to that, and the same here, maybe a bit of a curve. So let's do that next. Alright, so remember, we always want to mark on the back of the leather. You don't really want to see your drawings on the front. Now I've just got this wooden bowl here. It doesn't need a huge amount of shape to it. just enough, just to soften it a little, I suppose. So I'm just going to draw around the ball. That gives us a line to cut on. Now, the same here for the flap. So we don't want to take too much off. Let's just radius those corners. And for that, let's go a slightly larger radius than we used for the bottom of the pouch. Okay, even better idea on how it's going to look now. Let's just round these over a little more, smooth that in a bit better. Yeah, that's good. Okay, next step, let's do some stitching. Now I like to use this hemp thread, so it's waxed hemp. Hemp is very, very tough, very strong. And this thread, I think it's about 0.7 of a millimeter thick. You can get it in different colours. I like this colour because it looks nice against Veg Tan leather once it's been waxed, and you will see that later on. Now, the needles I use, and I think most people would probably use for this type of leather work, have a rounded end. Not sure whether the camera can focus on that. Yeah, it looks alright. So they have a rounded end. Upholstery needles, that sort of thing, best bet, in my opinion, is eBay. Same for the thread. So we need to take a length of this thread. Ideally, we want to have enough thread to get all the way around, but if you don't pull off enough to start with, it's not the end of the world. It just means you'll have one little odd looking stitch on your pouch. But if you can, it's best to go a little bit extra, more than you think you'll need, so that it looks nice when it's done. Now, we use 2 needles for this type of stitch. It's called saddle stitch. And yeah, 2 needles simultaneously. It does sound intimidating, but it's easy. So we need 1 needle on one end of the thread and a needle on the other end of the thread. Being waxed, this thread is almost like a monofilament. Very easy to thread needles, especially these guys with the nice big eyes on them. Alright, doesn't really matter where you start, as long as it's at the beginning of one set of your punched holes. Thread 1 needle through, and now you want to even up the thread on each side. Just like that. Okay, because this is our first stitch, I'm going to go do a stitch to the edge. So now this is what it looks like. We've got a needle each side. I'll just adjust that a little bit. Have a look in there. Okay, that's pretty good. So a needle each side. You can see this one on this side. We want to go over the edge, back through the same hole, and pull it through. Now if it gets a little bit tough, grab some pliers, just give it a tug, no problems. Alright, I'm going to pull that thread through. You can see it makes a little loop there. Nice and tight. Now we're going to grab the other needle and we're going to go through the other way. And what this is doing is giving the thread and the pouch a really nice secure point, because these these edge points here, if you think about how a pouch like this is going to be used, you know, opening and closing, this point here is going to end up being under quite a bit of strain and stress. So a nice double stitch like that to start off with makes sure that this pouch will stay nice and strong. Alright, now ideally you'd have what's called a stitching horse. I don't have a stitching horse, so all this is just going to be held while I stitch. You can see this needle and the thread is coming out this side here. We go to the next hole and we push it through. And then pull it through. Now you grab the other needle and you go through the same hole. If it gets tough, again, just grab some pliers, pull it through, no problems. And so when you pull it tight, you can see a nice strong stitch on each side there. The reason this stitch is useful for this type of leather working is because although this thread is strong and very abrasion resistant, obviously traditionally this stitch was used for saddles, hence the name. Lots of abrasion, lots of wear and tear there. If one of the threads happened to rub through, say the thread on this side rubbed through, because there's a double stitch through that hole, there's still a thread on the other side holding everything together, so your piece isn't going to just fall apart. Don't really need to explain why that's useful. So then we just continue on all the way around. Alright, so we're up to the last stitch now. Just going to go through as we have been. We're going to finish the stitching the exact same way we started it. So we've got a needle on each side. We're going to move one side with one of the needles. Create a loop, but we're not going to quite close it yet. Just leave a loop there. And then back through with the other. Same thing, just leave the loop. Now, you can see we've got this thread on this side here. We want this guy to be locked in by those two loops. So, getting a close up. If we pass the needle through those loops, then when that's pulled tight, it'll lock the thread in place, and then we'll flip it over and do the same thing here. Once we've done that, pull it nice and tight, get your stitching aligned there so it looks good. Give it a good tight pull. This thread's tough, so if you're using it, crank it right up. Great. All we have to do is trim the threads. Leave about a 5mm tail. And that's our stitching done. With our little pouch there. Next step, we're going to move on to the wet forming. Okay, so you can see I've got a bowl of warm water here. Doesn't need to be hot, just warm, and that'll help soften the leather. Probably not quite enough water there. Immerse the leather anyway. Just top the water up as needed. Okay. So make sure that the leather's pushed under. You can see it bubbling there as the air escapes. And we want to get this nice and soaked. Open it up, get the air bubbles out, flip it over, same deal. You just want to make sure that every pore of the leather has water in it. As you can see, it stopped fizzing. Already the leather's soft and pliable. So, as I mentioned, I'm using this cork sanding block as a former. See, I mean, it holds water already. As it is, it's swollen and closed up. Now, we're going to do our very best to get this cork block in there. It's going to be tight. It's going to be very tight. But the leather is soft and stretchy, so we should be able to get it in there a bit at least. Oh. Okay. Now we're just going to put this aside and let it dry. So it's the next day, and along with a much better camera angle, hopefully, we have a dry pouch. So we're going to remove the cork block now and see what we're left with. So you can see that the pouch has retained the shape now that it's dry. It's solid, nice and hard. So the next step is really to punch a hole for the little Chicago screw that we're going to use, and also punch a hole for in the flap for the closing mechanism. So this step is probably better done before we stitch it together, but nevertheless, here we are. All I want to do is find the center of the pouch, which is around there. Now this pen that I'm using, the ink is soluble in water, so it can be removed just with a little water. Now, this is the Chicago screw that we'll be using. You can see it unscrews there. This bit one side, this bit the other side of the leather, and then there's a nice little knob or toggle which will be used to secure the flap. So because the thread on this is only tiny, sort of 3mm roughly, not sure whether it's standard or not, the smallest punch I've got is just the right size. So I'm going to measure down from that center point, and we want to make sure that the base of this doesn't overhang, so it's about 9mm. Let's come down 6mm and make that the center of our punch hole, and we should be all good. So I'm just going to, because I didn't do this before stitching it, I need something to strike against. The cork block is perfect. Now, lining up the punch. Didn't quite make it all the way through there. Let's have another go. A few leftover bits in the punch there. We've got it there. Great. Okay, so now for the Chicago screw. Thread goes in from the back, knob screws on the front. I just want to test fit it at this stage, but all looking good. So now what we're going to do is bend the flap down make sure it's centered, nicely aligned. Looks pretty good there to me. And I'm just going to mark right where that knob meets. Seems to be a little off. We've got about the depth there, we can measure across. Side to side, and mark the centre, and now we know exactly where we need to punch our hole. So you need to use a hole or a punch that's slightly smaller than the Chicago screw, the knob on the Chicago screw, so that when it fits it clips in place. So I'm just going to line my punch up with the mark that I've made. There we go. So at the moment, obviously the hole's a bit small, but with this type of fixing arrangement, we actually make a small slit. Doesn't need to be very long. Let's go for 8mm in the center of the hole, heading back away from the edge of the leather. So mark it. And I'm just going to take a knife. And make that cut. Make sure it's all the way through, nice and clean. And we can try it out. May need a little wearing in, because the leather's quite stiff from the water. But you can see that's how it'll lock in place. Okay, so what we're going to do now is clean up all the edges and then move on to waxing. So I've just got some sandpaper here. It's 150 grit garnet. You can use whatever you have. And before I get started with that, I'm going to take my knife and any edges where there's a large discrepancy between the two layers, just shave it off. Once we've done that, just take the sandpaper. I'm just going to tear a small piece off here, make it a bit easier to handle. And you don't want to sand the thread that we've stitched here for obvious reasons. Just tidy it up. You can see that I've also cleaned up around the edge of the flap, just getting rid of some of the furry bits. So now that you're happy with with how the edges are, it's all neat and tidy, we're going to move on to the waxing. I'm using beeswax because I can get plenty of it for nothing, and it's natural, smells nice, colour's nice. So I'm going to start just by rubbing the wax on the leather. Try and get a fair amount of wax on there, nice and evenly. Over the threads as well, added protection. Even though it's waxed thread, as you feed it in and out of the leather, the wax does have a tendency to rub off, so if you can protect it again, it's always a good idea. Get the edges too, the exposed edges. We can burnish those later and they'll be really neat and tidy. So once you've got a good covering of wax, grab a heat gun or a hairdryer, whatever you've got. You don't need it too hot. You just want to warm the wax and the leather. And what this does, well, you can see, melts the wax, opens the pores in the leather, and just allows the wax to seep in. The leather's nice and warm now, so the wax will spread even easier. So once we're done with the waxing, we're going to burnish the edges. So yeah, something round like a screwdriver shaft works a lot better because it's not going to scrape the leather at all. This also just sort of forces the two layers together. It makes the seam less visible. Makes the pouch more waterproof if that's something that you're going for. So you can see, after working on that for a while, you want to make sure that the edges don't flare out too much. You can kind of get in there and push them back down. But you can see that seam, compare that to on this side, much nicer. So I'll keep doing that, finish it off. So now you can see that my edges are nicely burnished. The pouch has cooled down for the most part. It's very stiff. All that's left to do is put our Chicago screw back in. There we are. Just going to finish the pouch off by burning the business's initials into the back. There we go, finished pouch.